The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Katie Rodriguez pushed the medication cart down the ICU corridor, her white scrubs so crisp they whispered against her skin. Sacred Heart in Raleigh had the particular smell of every hospital everywhere, antiseptic layered over something darker, something that never quite washed away no matter how much bleach they used. She moved with the kind of practiced invisibility that came from 5 years of nursing, 5 years of being background in other people's emergencies. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the 6 a.m. medications into their plastic cups, small tremors that came only when she thought about the life compressed into a battered military-issue duffel bag in her apartment closet. Not the trembling of fear. The trembling of restraint. 23 years. That's how long she'd held things together. 23 years of being the person who stayed calm when other people broke, when other people screamed, when other people did the breaking themselves. Then came the classified operation in Ramadi that the Pentagon decided didn't happen, and suddenly Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez was supposed to be dead. Officially dead. Her service record redacted, her name erased from every official database like digital acid had dissolved her. So she became a nurse instead. A career you could have without a past. A career where no one asked questions because every shift was its own closed case. The boot sat in her locker like a prayer she couldn't voice out loud. Worn tan leather, sand still caught in the laces from 2009, scratched and creased from 1,000 desert operations she was no longer permitted to remember. She touched them every morning at 6:19 a.m., the exact moment her shift began, the exact moment she stepped into her second life. The leather was cool and familiar, smoother than the stainless steel of the supply carts, warmer than the fluorescent-lit certainty of her new uniform. Some rituals don't need explaining. The intercom crackled at 7:15 a.m. Incoming trauma. Incoming trauma. ETA 5 minutes. Katie's body responded before her mind caught up. She moved toward the trauma bay without conscious thought, a body remembering things her civilian mind was supposed to have forgotten. The charge nurse, Margaret, was already barking assignments. Rodriguez, set up bay 3. 2-bed rotation. This one's critical. The gurney arrived wheeling through the automatic doors at 7:19 a.m., and the first thing Katie saw was the uniform. Special Forces insignia. The second thing she saw was the face, and the breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her lungs where it had no business being. She knew this man. Not personally. Not in any documented way. But she knew his voice from radio calls, knew his record from classified briefings, knew his reputation from the SEAL Team 3 rotation that had overlapped hers in Anbar Province. Captain James Mitchell, Charlie Platoon, had been one of the bright spots in a dark year. 19-year-old Marines treated him like a god. He'd kept them alive in impossible situations through a combination of relentless competence and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a room. Now he lay completely motionless on the stretcher, his entire body paralyzed from the shoulders down, his eyes tracking the ceiling like he was calculating angles for a kill shot that would never come. The chart said tension pneumothorax complicated by spinal cord involvement. A training exercise gone catastrophically wrong. Mercy Hospital in Charlotte had stabilized him, but he was bleeding internally, the doctors said. Prognosis poor. Outcome unlikely. The kind of case that made hospitals nervous about liability, about settlements, about the families who sued when hope ran out. Katie's hands moved with muscle memory as she checked the equipment, the wall suction, the oxygen, the crash cart within arm's reach. She could see the family through the observation window. A woman with his jawline, graying at the temples, her hands white-knuckled around the arm of a man who looked like her husband. And beside them, a boy in his early 20s, also with that same bearing, that same compressed intensity. They'd brought something with them. 2 objects placed carefully on the small side table, a framed photograph and a pair of boots. Worn tan leather. Sand in the laces. Ramadi boots. Katie's hands went still. The boots were identical to hers, down to the way the left heel was scarred and the right had a small burn mark from a diesel fire in 2008. Which meant Rodriguez. Margaret's voice cut through the moment. Get his vitals. Everything. Katie moved. Muscle memory took over. BP 156/91. Heart rate 118. O2 saturation 94, climbing slowly on room air. Respiration shallow, 14 breaths per minute. All of it terrible. All of it the kind of clinical data that made experienced doctors lower their eyes and start thinking about the next patient. "He's Miguel's commanding officer," Katie said quietly. It wasn't information Margaret needed. It was information Katie needed to say out loud, to confirm the thread connecting her hidden life to her visible one. "Your son?" Margaret raised her eyebrows. Even more reason to get him stable, then. "Come on, let's move." Dr. Sterling arrived at 8:02 a.m. with the kind of entrance that seemed to require a soundtrack. He swept into the ICU trailing 6 residents like a cortege, his silver hair catching the overhead lights, his Italian suit pressed with the kind of precision that suggested he'd never encountered a wrinkled moment in his life. His shoes were polished mirrors. His stethoscope hung like a medal around his neck, but it was his eyes that announced his true rank, the eyes of a man who'd spent 27 years at Sacred Heart building a reputation that started and ended with himself. Katie had been at Sacred Heart for 5 years. 5 years meant she knew how to read a room. How to know who held power by the way other people's shoulders bent toward them. How to recognize the moment a decision had already been made before it was officially announced. Dr. Sterling moved toward the captain's bay with the deliberate slowness of a man performing for an audience. His residents fell into formation, pens raised, ready to document whatever wisdom was about to emerge from the chief of medicine's mouth. "Let's see what disaster we're inheriting today," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the unit like an announcement. He didn't glance at Katie as he spoke. She was fixtures and equipment to him, no different from the 4 poles or the monitor stands. She felt him approach before he arrived. Some part of her body remembered how to recognize authority that moved like weaponry. The residents were 3 deep now, 8 of them, their white coats starched into defensive angles. Sterling read the chart without touching it, his eyes moving across the vital signs with the kind of clinical assessment that was already rendering judgment. "Spinal cord injury," he said. "Partial." "Incomplete," one of the residents corrected quietly. "He has some lower extremity sensation." "That just prolongs the suffering," Sterling replied, and Katie watched the family's faces through the observation window collapse like the moment before they understood the funeral was already over. "How much hemorrhage?" "We're estimating moderate. Internal bleeding, likely retroperitoneal. Trauma surgery consulted and recommended conservative management. No surgical intervention without stabilization first." Sterling made a small noise, something between agreement and dismissal. He turned to face his residents in a way that made it clear they were about to receive wisdom. "This case presents what we in medicine call a poor risk-to-benefit ratio. A young man with permanent neurological damage, internal bleeding, and a prognosis that trends toward extended ICU stay, eventual complications, infection. You could spend weeks here, burn through resources, and still watch him decline." He paused. "Let them absorb this. My recommendation will be to make him comfortable. Palliative focus. If his family wants aggressive intervention, we'll provide it, but they need to understand that hope is not a care plan. We do no good here. What we do is delay the inevitable while creating suffering." The words fell into the silence like stones into water. Katie's hands continued their work, checking the 4, adjusting the monitor leads, documenting vitals, but something in her chest had folded inward and turned to stone. "Any questions?" Sterling asked, already moving toward the next patient, his residents trailing after him like ducklings. "Doctor." Katie's voice was quiet, but it cut through the ambient hospital noise with surprising clarity. "Captain Mitchell has minimal intracranial pressure, intact airway reflexes, and spinal cord swelling that typically responds to aggressive anti-inflammatory protocol over 14 to 21 days. Siwara outcomes can be surprisingly good with intensive management." Sterling stopped. He turned slowly. For a moment, he simply looked at her, at this woman in white scrubs who'd just spoken medical terminology he apparently didn't expect her to possess. His chart doesn't support that optimism, Sterling said finally, his voice now holding the kind of careful precision people use when they're speaking to someone they've decided is confused. I'm not offering optimism, Katie said. I'm offering data. We have time before end organ damage begins. We use that time. One of the residents made a small sound. Margaret's jaw tightened. Sterling's eyes narrowed, and Katie saw the exact moment he classified her as a problem. Not a nurse with a valid clinical observation. A problem. A nurse who'd stepped outside the established hierarchy and needed to be reminded of her place. Your job is to manage medications and monitor vitals, Rodriguez, Sterling said, and his voice now carried the kind of edge that was meant to cut, that Sheffield steel voice that made juniors question their medical school acceptance letters. My job is to make the clinical decisions. I suggest you remember that distinction. He turned back to his residents. As I was saying, comfort measures and family counseling will be our focus. Let's move on. They swept out of the unit in a coordinated movement, leaving a silence behind them that seemed to have weight. Katie continued organizing the medications. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. She did not let the burning in her chest show on her face. Instead, she turned to the captain's monitor, watched the numbers tracking across the screen, and very quietly made the decision that would change everything. She would save this man. Not because Dr. Sterling had ordered her to be comfortable. Not because the prognosis was poor. But because she recognized something in the stillness of his paralyzed body, in the angle of his head turning slightly toward the boots his family had brought. She recognized the absolute refusal to accept defeat. And that was something Katie Rodriguez understood at the molecular level, something that lived in her bones and her muscle memory and the classified parts of her that supposedly didn't exist anymore. The boots sat on the side table, waiting. The captain's eyes tracked her movement as she passed his window. And somewhere in the fluorescent-lit silence of Sacred Heart ICU in Raleigh, North Carolina, a nurse who wasn't supposed to exist anymore made the kind of decision that ended careers. The morning briefing started at 7:30. 12 doctors arrived at Sacred Heart's ICU between then and 9. 12. Not 11. Not a handful. 12 attending physicians, neurosurgeons, trauma specialists, and consultants filed past the captain's chart like pallbearers at a funeral they'd already decided to skip. Each one left the same way, folder closed, head shaken, a variation of the same sentence delivered to Dr. Sterling with the practiced regret of men who'd learned that liabilities was a better word than inconvenient. Katie watched from the supply station, her hands arranging for tubing with mechanical precision while her eyes tracked each refusal. The first doctor, Hartley from neurosurgery, took 40 seconds. Paraplegia at T4 with no motor recovery indicators. Not our service. Not our problem. Sterling nodded like a man collecting signatures on a document. The second, an orthopedic attending, spent 90 seconds scanning the imaging. Recovery window is closed. You know it. I know it. Sterling made a note. The third didn't even ask questions. Just closed the chart and walked away. By the 8th refusal, Sterling had stopped bothering to nod. He'd built his fortress. The consensus was becoming visible, tangible, something a jury could understand. The patient was gone. The captain was already dead, the hospital was just choosing not to keep the body warm. Katie's chest felt compressed, as if someone had wrapped steel bands around her ribs and was tightening them one breath at a time. In Ramadi, you didn't have the luxury of consensus. You didn't get to ask 12 people if the bleeding kid on the 10th floor was worth saving. You just saved him. You saved him because he was there and you were there, and the alternative was watching him die while you debated liability. The 11th doctor arrived at 8:45. Orthoplastic surgery. The 12th at 9:14. Infectious disease, there to confirm the captain's immunocompromised status as additional reason for palliation. Sterling thanked him with the warmth of a man whose case was now mathematically bulletproof. That afternoon, during rounds, Sterling stopped at the captain's bedside. The young officer lay still as stone, eyes tracking the movement of the room, aware but unreachable. His parents sat in the corner chairs, the mother with her hand over her mouth, the father's jaw clenched so hard Katie could see the muscle working from across the room. Katie had pulled the captain's chart to suggest a treatment protocol, something aggressive, something that didn't assume surrender. She'd written out the parameters: aggressive physical therapy, experimental stem cell work being done at Duke, a case study from Johns Hopkins showing motor recovery in T for injuries even 18 months post-incident. It wasn't hope. It was data. It was the kind of thing you could stake a patient's life on if you weren't afraid of losing it. Sterling's rounds moved through the ICU with the precision of a surgeon entering an operating theater. He was walking toward the captain's room when Katie stepped forward, chart in hand, her voice soft and professional. "Dr. Sterling, I wanted to present some alternative treatment protocols for..." He stopped mid-stride. Turned slowly. His eyes, pale gray and empty as a winter sky, fixed on hers with the kind of focus that made the fluorescent lights seem to dim. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, and his voice carried across the room like a blade crossing marble. "When I need a glorified pill dispenser's opinion on neurosurgical cases, I'll be sure to ask." He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The residents assembled for rounds shifted their weight from foot to foot like animals sensing a predator. "Perhaps you misunderstood your job description. It's not to have opinions. It's to follow protocols established by physicians." "That would be me." The captain's mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The father's hand found her shoulder. Katie lowered the chart. Said nothing. The silence in the room became physical, a presence of its own, like humidity before a storm. Sterling finished rounds without looking back. But 3 hours later, something appeared on the unit board in the nursing station, a laminated sheet with the hospital's official letterhead, signed and dated and placed directly where every nurse and doctor passed multiple times per shift. It read, "Staff Performance Issue, Disciplinary Notice. Employee, Rodriguez, K. Charge, Insubordination and Reckless Patient Advocacy. Recommendation, Immediate retraining and supervised practice." Katie read it while standing at the medication cart, her fingers steady on the syringe she was drawing. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't water. She simply read each word with the same attention she'd give to a medication label, clinical, precise, detached. Then she continued drawing up the medication. But the break room cleared like a toxic spill whenever she entered. The nurses who'd been friendly during the previous weeks suddenly had urgent tasks elsewhere. The resident who'd complimented her line placement last Tuesday now found her staring at her phone with sudden intensity whenever Katie appeared. The respiratory therapist who'd joked about the hospital coffee just yesterday grabbed his lunch and left without explanation, his eyes deliberately fixed away from hers. Sterling passed by the break room window during her lunch break. Made eye contact. Smiled, the kind of smile a cat makes before swallowing a mouse. Katie sat alone with the humming vending machine and a sandwich she didn't want. The fluorescent light above her flickered in a way that suggested it would burn out soon, and nobody had bothered to replace it yet. The overhead speaker played soft jazz that sounded like it had been chosen by someone who'd never actually listened to jazz. At 7 o'clock, during the evening shift change, she went to the supply closet and pulled out a pair of combat boots. They were weathered, scarred, the leather creased by years of sand and blood and desert heat that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. The laces were frayed. The heels were worn asymmetrical, one more than the other, the way boots wear when a soldier favors one leg, nursing an injury that never quite heals. The captain's parents had brought them. His mother had pressed them into Katie's hands in the hallway and whispered, "He asked for these. We don't know why. We thought maybe you could, maybe he'd tell you." Katie carried them to the captain's room. The mother had stepped out briefly. The father dozed in the chair, his head tilted back, his breathing rough with exhaustion. The captain's eyes followed her as she crossed the room. His breathing machine wheezed its mechanical rhythm, a sound like an animal trapped in a basement, desperate and repetitive. She placed the boots on the bedside table, positioned them so they were the first thing he'd see when he opened his eyes at 2 in the morning, the time when paralyzed soldiers think about never walking again. When they think about what walking meant. Crouching beside the bed, her fingers trailing across the worn leather for just a moment, Katie said nothing. There was nothing to say. The boot said it all. This is what survival looks like. This is what scars look like. This is what soldiers bring home, and soldiers don't leave other soldiers behind. The captain's mother returned and found her there, kneeling beside the bed like she was making a vow in a church instead of a hospital. The woman's face crumpled. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself and asked quietly, "Why are you the only one fighting for him?" Katie stood without answering. Because there was no answer that made sense to someone who hadn't stood in Ramadi. There was no way to explain that some people don't get the choice of walking away. That once you've made the choice to save someone, you can't unmake it because a doctor in a pressed white coat tells you there's no point. 5 hours into the evening shift, at 11:47, the captain's monitor began its alarm. Not a warning pulse. A scream. The oxygen saturation dropped like a stone falling down a well, 96, 92, 88, 84, the numbers erasing themselves on the display so fast they barely registered as real. His chest wall went rigid. The left lung stopped breathing. Tension pneumothorax. The resident on call froze, a young man barely out of training, his hands hovering over the cart like a pianist forgetting the notes mid-song. He paged the attending. He followed protocol. He did everything exactly right, which meant he did nothing at all. The monitor's alarm became a shriek. The captain's lips were turning blue. The trachea was deviating, pushing his heart off-center, the pressure in his chest rising like a balloon inflating with concrete. Minutes. He had maybe 3 minutes before the pressure would crush his heart into uselessness and he'd die on a hospital bed with his mother in the hallway and his commanding officer's boots on his bedside table. Katie was already moving. Her hands found the needle decompression kit before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory from Ramadi, from the field hospital, from the days when there were no attending surgeons, just the person who knew how to keep people alive and the person who would die if they didn't. The 14-gauge needle was sharp enough to cut through skin and the pleural lining in one clean motion. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She could see it on his chest like a map she'd memorized years ago. The landmarks were the same on every human being, ribs, spaces, the precise point where you punched through and released the pneumothorax like letting air out of a tire. Sterling appeared in the doorway. His voice was ice. "Nurse Rodriguez, step away from that patient immediately or I will have security remove you." He said it with the confidence of a man who'd made 7 phone calls and knew exactly which security guard would be most compliant. "We are following hospital protocol. We are waiting for the attending surgeon. You will step away now." Katie's hands were trembling, not from fear, from restraint. The kind of trembling that happens when every muscle in your body is screaming to finish the task and your brain is desperately trying not to destroy your life. The captain's mother stood in the hallway behind Sterling, her hand over her mouth, watching her son's oxygen saturation fall to 72. The monitor screamed higher. His lips were nearly black. Katie's fingers found the precise point on his chest and positioned the needle. 18 gauge. 3 centimeters. Push through the skin, push through the fascia, push through the parietal pleura until you heard the hiss of pneumothorax releasing like the world finally letting out the breath it had been holding. 5 hours into her overnight shift, the monitor's alarm split the silence like a rifle shot. Katie's hands moved before her mind caught up. The captain's chest was rigid. Breath sounds gone on the left side. His oxygen saturation dropping, 94, 91, 88. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the air wasn't moving where it needed to go. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis hit her with the certainty of muscle memory, the kind of knowing that came from holding a bleeding soldier's chest in Ramadi while rounds snapped overhead and the medic screamed for a needle. She was already moving toward the bedside when Sterling's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "Step away from that patient, Rodriguez." The residents froze. The nurses froze. The only sound was the monitor climbing toward crisis 85, 82, 79, and the ventilator gasping like a drowning man. Katie didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge him. Her hands found the 14-gauge angiocath needle in the crash cart with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorms, in blackout conditions, with artillery fire painting the sky orange above her. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether you were in a desert operating room or Sacred Heart Hospital. Rodriguez, I am ordering you to step back. She prepped the site with chlorhexidine. One resident reached forward. Katie's eyes met his for half a second, just enough. He stepped back. Sterling was moving now, his face going from red to white to a shade of crimson that matched the vital signs monitor. You will be terminated for this insubordination. You understand me? Terminated. Katie's voice came out steady, factual, the voice of someone reading coordinates in a targeting system. Left pneumothorax. Tamponade progression. He's got maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. The needle went in. Through skin. Through fascia. Through the parietal pleura. The hiss filled the room, that unmistakable sound of pressure releasing, of a sealed system rupturing and the atmosphere finally equalizing. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a life not ending at 2:44 a.m. on a Tuesday in Raleigh, North Carolina. The captain's oxygen saturation began climbing immediately. 82, 85, 88, 91. The monitor's rhythm stabilized. His chest began to rise and fall in synchronization with the ventilator. The mechanical wheeze became purposeful again, productive again, alive again. The silence that followed was the kind that only comes when people recognize they've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. The resident stepped back, not because Katie told them to, but because the authority in that room had shifted like continental plates grinding beneath the hospital's foundation. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. The procedure had taken 47 seconds from alarm to stable vital signs, and every second of it had been executed with the kind of military precision that couldn't be taught in a nursing program. Sterling's phone was already in his hand. Katie continued working, checking the needle placement, confirming no subcutaneous air, documenting vital signs with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that perfection wouldn't save her but that anything less would be disrespectful to the captain still fighting for consciousness on that bed. She didn't look at Sterling. Didn't acknowledge the three residents who couldn't seem to decide whether to leave or stay. Her focus was absolute, blood pressure 112/68, heart rate 108 and dropping, oxygen saturation 96% and steady. Get me a chest tube kit, she said quietly to the youngest resident, the one who hadn't yet learned that career survival sometimes meant silence. And call Dr. Bannister in trauma. Tell him we're moving to ICU, not because of politics, but because this patient is going to live. The resident nodded and moved. That's all it took. That's all any of them ever needed, someone to speak in a voice that sounded like it knew what it was doing. Sterling left the room. Katie heard him in the hallway, his voice tight, precise, the voice of a man activating every institutional weapon in his arsenal. Yes. 3 calls. Now. I need board members. I need the personnel department. Yes, it's urgent. No, I'm not exaggerating. The captain's parents arrived at 3:15 a.m., their son's commanding officer, the young captain whose family had fought to bring him to Sacred Heart in the first place, escorting them through the hospital doors. They saw Katie first, saw the steady competence in her movements, the way she was checking the chest tube placement, the way she didn't rush, didn't hesitate, moved like someone who had earned the right to be calm in crisis. His mother grabbed Katie's arm. You saved him. You actually saved him. Katie didn't look away from her work. He saved himself. I just gave him the chance. By 4:53 a.m., the first investigator was already waiting in the conference room. By 4:45 a.m., Sterling had called 3 board members and Katie's nursing school, asking pointed questions about her stability, her judgment, her tendency toward what he called reckless insubordination during her training years. By dawn, an outside consultant was combing through her personnel file, looking for anything actionable, anything that could justify what was about to happen. Katie continued her shift with mechanical precision. Vitals every 15 minutes. Medications charted to the second. The captain's oxygen saturation remained stable. His heart rhythm remained sinus, strong, the rhythm of a man whose body had decided to keep fighting because someone in scrubs had given him the tools to do it. His parents sat vigil, watching their son's chest rise and fall, watching the monitors display all the green numbers that meant he was still here, still fighting, still belonged to this world. At 7:44 a.m., as the day shift nurse arrived to take over, Katie saw Sterling outside the captain's room. He was making another call, his jaw tight, his eyes tracking her movements through the unit like a sniper measuring distance and wind speed. She could read the calculation in his face. He was no longer the man who'd ordered her to stand down. He was now the man who had to explain why he'd ordered her to stand down, and that was something he had absolutely no intention of doing. The chief of staff was waiting in his office at 7:45 a.m. Sterling stood beside him, and Katie understood in that moment that whatever was about to happen had already been decided somewhere in the institutional apparatus, in some conference room where liability and reputation and the delicate architecture of a hospital's insurance coverage mattered more than one captain's life. Katie, the chief of staff began, and there was regret in his voice, the kind that comes from having to execute decisions someone else had already made. "We need to discuss what happened on the unit this morning." She said nothing. "Let the silence do the work. Dr. Sterling has expressed serious concerns about your unauthorized medical intervention. While I understand the captain's outcome was positive, the procedure you performed exceeded your scope as a registered nurse. You didn't consult. You didn't wait for physician approval. You acted unilaterally." "He was dying," Katie said flatly. "I understand that's how you perceived the situation. But the protocol exists for a reason. You compromised patient safety by circumventing the chain of command." The words hung there like smoke. Katie could see Sterling's face, could see the faintest smile of vindication, the look of a man who had finally managed to box in a problem that wouldn't stay quiet. Her unauthorized procedure, however successful, represented unacceptable liability. Effective immediately, her employment was terminated. She would receive 2 weeks severance pay and a neutral reference. She should consider this an opportunity to reflect on her approach to patient care in a collaborative environment. A security guard handed her an empty cardboard box at the employee exit. Katie placed her name badge inside, then the dying succulent plant from her locker, then the framed photograph of her SEAL team, Ramadi, 2009, 8 faces smiling for the camera, only 3 of them still alive. The rain hammered the parking lot as she waited for the bus, the cardboard box balanced on her knees, water pooling at her feet, and for just a moment she wondered if disappearing completely would have been easier than this half-life of hiding, of being erased, of having her hands tied while someone else made the rules about who deserved saving. The rain came down like shrapnel, hammering the parking lot in waves. Katie sat on the metal bench outside Sacred Heart, her white scrubs already soaked through, clinging to her shoulders like a second skin. The cardboard box balanced on her knees felt heavier than it should have. Inside, a cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A dying succulent, its leaves brown at the edges, still clinging to life. And the photograph. She stared at it through the rain-spotted plastic frame. Ramadi, 2009. 8 faces. Young faces. 3 of them were still breathing. The others lived only in classified files that no longer bore her name. Her phone buzzed again. 17 missed calls from Miguel. She couldn't answer. Couldn't explain that she'd saved his commanding officer's life and ended her own in the same 5 hours. The bus shelter glass was streaked with water, and through it she could see the emergency room entrance where she'd punched a needle through a man's chest cavity while Sterling barked orders to let him die. Inside Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, watching the rain obscure the parking lot below. His hands moved with surgical precision across his desk phone. 3 calls. 3 board members. Each one a chess piece he'd positioned carefully over 2 decades of hospital politics. The first call lasted 90 seconds. The second, exactly 2 minutes. By the third, his voice had taken on the practiced tone of a man delivering regrettable necessities. "I understand completely," he said into the receiver, his jaw clenched with what looked almost like concern. "Yes. Insubordination and reckless endangerment. No, I cannot recommend her for reassignment. Her judgment is fundamentally compromised." He hung up and immediately dialed a contact at Duke University's nursing school. The connection took 3 rings. Sterling waited, patient as a predator. "Dr. James Sterling, Sacred Heart Medical Center," he said when the phone picked up. "I'm calling regarding Katie Rodriguez, class of 2012. We need to discuss some concerns about her psychological stability." "Yes. Last night. A serious lapse in clinical judgment. Very serious. By 4 in the morning, an investigator from the hospital's external compliance firm was already en route to Raleigh. Sterling had ensured it, 1 email marked urgent to the Chief of Staff, carbon copied to 3 board members. The investigator arrived at 6 and was shown directly to the records room. She carried a leather portfolio and the kind of practice neutrality that came from destroying careers for 15 years without ever raising her voice. Sterling watched from across the hallway, arms folded, his expression grave as a pallbearer's. The investigator pulled Katie's personnel file. He'd already prepared the documentation. The write-up from the unit board, dated and witnessed. The physician's notes questioning her clinical competence. A summary from a staff meeting where he'd mentioned, just in passing, nothing accusatory, that Katie seemed increasingly unstable and disconnected from protocol. The investigator made notes. No expression. Just the sound of pen on paper. At noon, Katie was called into the Chief of Staff's office. She knew what was coming. The walk down the corridor felt like moving through water, each step slower than the last. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical hum. A nurse she'd worked with for 4 years was at the station and couldn't meet her eyes. Another turned away entirely. The break room had already learned to hate her before the official termination. Chief of Staff Harrison sat behind his mahogany desk, his face arranged in the mask of a man delivering necessary sadness. Sterling stood behind his right shoulder, close enough that Katie could see the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. "Katie, we've completed our investigation into last night's events," Harrison began, his fingers steepled. "The needle decompression procedure you performed was unauthorized. Regardless of outcome, you operated outside your scope of practice and against direct instruction from your supervising physician. That's not acceptable in this environment. We cannot maintain standards if every nurse decides to override physician orders." Katie said nothing. Her hands rested flat on her thighs. "We've reviewed your file," Harrison continued. "There are patterns here. Repeated instances of questioning clinical decisions. Recommendations from your nursing program indicating concerns about your stability. Last night was a culmination of those patterns. We're terminating your employment, effective immediately. You'll receive 6-week severance. Your benefits end Friday." She stood. Didn't speak. Didn't blink. Just nodded once, the way someone acknowledges a weather report. Sterling's smile widened fractionally. "Your badge and access card," Harrison said, not unkindly. The man was good at this. He genuinely seemed to feel bad. That made him worse. Katie removed her badge and slid it across the desk. The plastic was still warm from her shift. She watched it settle in the space between them, a final punctuation mark. Security walked her out. Not roughly, just thoroughly. They carried her cardboard box of personal items because hospital policy required it. A cracked mug. A dying plant. A photograph of 8 young faces where 3 were already ghosts. The rain was relentless. Katie sat at the bus stop 2 blocks from Sacred Heart, the box balanced on her knees, water streaming down her neck. She stared at the photograph through the plastic, at the faces that belonged to the woman she wasn't supposed to be anymore. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez didn't exist. She'd been erased 5 years ago when she answered the phone at 2,300 hours and took orders that couldn't be written down. Those orders had saved 43 people in Ramadi, including 12 civilians, but the Pentagon had decided that some victories were too classified for history. She'd become just a nurse. Deferential. Quiet. Compliant. And now she was unemployed. The cardboard was beginning to disintegrate where the rain soaked through. The photograph's edges were blurring, the 8 faces melting into watercolor shadows. Katie thought about the extraction in Ramadi, the sustained enemy fire, the 7 operators she'd kept breathing when the forward surgical team was compromised. She thought about the combat boots still locked in her locker upstairs, the pair the captain's parents had brought from his apartment in Fayetteville, the one she'd placed at his bedside as a promise that some soldiers never stop fighting. She'd kept that promise. And it had cost her everything. A car pulled up hard through the rain, headlights cutting through the downpour at an angle that meant speed. Not the bus. Not anything scheduled. A sedan, windshield wipers moving frantically, emergency flashes blinking like a distress signal. Miguel burst out before the car fully stopped, his backpack open, water streaming down his teenage face. His hand shook as he ran toward the bus shelter. Something metallic spilled from his pack, multiple somethings, tumbling into his palms and fingers. His voice came out raw, urgent, carrying the kind of desperation that only came when a 17-year-old finally understood his mother wasn't what she'd said. "Mom," he gasped, breathing hard. "We have to go back. Right now. They're calling. All of them. They said you need to be there. They said." Katie stood, the cardboard box falling to the ground, the mug and photograph scattering across wet concrete. "Miguel, what?" "Your records," he said, his voice cracking. "Your real records. They declassified them. This morning. 6 a.m. Mom, they said you have the right to, they said you never have to hide again." The metals in his hands caught the streetlight. Katie's throat tightened. Sacred Heart's lobby felt like a courtroom when they arrived 15 minutes later. The staff had assembled like a jury. Sterling stood near the reception desk, his posture already beginning to shift from confidence to something fractionally less certain. The chief of staff was there. Board members in their weekend clothes, pulled from homes they didn't expect to leave. Nurses from multiple shifts. Security. An administrator with a file folder thick enough to contain an entire career. Miguel walked to the center of the lobby and emptied his backpack across the reception desk. The metal scattered and spun on the polished surface. His hands trembled as he turned to face the gathered crowd, water still dripping from his hair. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez," he said, his voice steadying as he spoke the name. "And I don't care what she was ordered to do or not do. You need to know who you just fired." A nurse Katie didn't recognize picked up the service file Miguel had brought. Her hands began to shake as she read the first line aloud. "Bronze Star with Valor," she whispered. She turned the page. Purple Heart. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross. The room didn't move. Katie stood motionless, rain still streaming from her scrubs, her hair plastered to her face. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song. The glass doors at the entrance opened. A SEAL team leader in dress uniform walked across the marble lobby like a man crossing a hostile position. His presence was the kind that made air molecules reorganize themselves. His voice carried across the space like a command frequency. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez coordinated medical evacuation of critical personnel under sustained enemy fire during Operation Ramadi Hammer, May 2009, he said. Each word was a weight. She performed emergency field surgery on 7 critically wounded operators. She held a defensive position for 11 hours. She saved 43 personnel including 12 civilians. He paused between each medal, letting each name settle into the lobby like a physical force. Silver Star. Sterling's face began to drain of color. Silver Star. The Chief of Staff stepped backward. Joint Service Commendation Medal. Presidential Unit Citation. 2 FBI agents entered through the same doors, badges visible, the kind of federal presence that made administrative decisions feel suddenly very small. The Ramadi extraction operation is effective immediately declassified, the senior agent announced. All records are being restored. Senior Chief Rodriguez is released from operational security restrictions as of 0600 hours this morning. Sterling's mouth opened and closed without sound. His hand reached for the desk and found nothing to grip. The smile was gone. In its place was the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd been playing checkers against someone from a war he'd never seen. Katie stood in the center of the lobby as the room reordered itself around her. The tiles beneath her feet were the same tiles she'd walked every shift for 4 years. The ceiling was the same ceiling. But the light falling through the windows seemed different now, like it was finally illuminating the right things. One of the board members approached Sterling with the kind of precision that came from having just understood an entire career mistake. "You're done here," she said quietly. "We'll discuss your severance with HR. Expect their call." Sterling turned and walked toward his office without speaking. Nobody moved to stop him. The crowd simply parted, creating a corridor of silence that he had to walk through alone. Miguel reached out and took his mother's hand. Miguel burst through Sacred Heart's glass doors like a man breaking through underwater, his backpack open, metal spilling across his shaking palms. Bronze. Silver. Gold catching the fluorescent light. His voice cracked when he found her in the lobby where board members stood arranged like pallbearers around a corpse that hadn't died yet. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez," he said. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. The Chief of Staff blinked twice. A nurse, the same one who'd whispered apologies in the break room for 3 days, picked up the declassified file with trembling hands and began to read. Valor in combat. Ramadi, 2009. Medical intervention under fire, 17 personnel extracted. Her voice steadied as the implications crashed through the room like a wave. Emergency response in hostile territory. Leadership under extreme duress. Commendation for selfless service above and beyond. The hospital doors opened again. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. A SEAL team leader in dress uniform strode through like he owned the marble itself, his presence making the air pressure change. His voice carried across the lobby with the weight of command, each word a hammer strike against everything Sterling had built. "Bronze Star for Valor," the commander said. His eyes never left Sterling's face. "Silver Star for Heroism in Combat Operations. Second Silver Star for Rescue Coordination that saved a helicopter crew. 2 Purple Hearts." He paused. The silence was so thick you could have operated in it. Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism in Action against an armed enemy. Sterling's face drained like someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again but nothing came out. 2 FBI agents entered behind the commander, their badges catching light as they moved. One of them spoke to the assembled board with the flat authority of federal power. The classified mission Senior Chief Rodriguez executed in Ramadi has been declassified as of this morning. She has been officially released from her silence obligation. The agent's eyes moved to Sterling. "We've reviewed her personnel file. Termination effective immediately for a life-saving procedure appears problematic from multiple angles." The 5th medal. That's when Sterling's hand started to shake. Not trembling, shaking. Like someone had cut the wires holding him together and he was short-circuiting in real time. The Chief of Staff turned away from him. The 3 board members Sterling had called in favors from wouldn't meet his eyes. One of them was checking his phone, probably ordering his own box. The security guard, the same one who'd handed Katie her cardboard box that morning with genuine regret in his eyes, appeared at Sterling's elbow. He was holding an identical box. Cardboard. Pathetic. The guard's voice was quiet, but it carried the satisfaction of a man watching cosmic justice execute itself. "Dr. Sterling, I believe you know the way out." Sterling's hand shook as he packed his office. Framed degrees. Awards from medical conferences he'd networked his way into. Photographs with board members whose calls he'd never receive again. His office was on the 3rd floor, same building where the captain was recovering, same building where Katie Rodriguez had been erased this morning and now stood vindicated. He carried the box through the lobby, past staff members who looked away from him the way a flock of birds parts around a branch falling from the sky. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. 6 months later, Miguel told Katie he'd seen Sterling at the mall. Not in a suit. Not in scrubs. Selling insurance from a folding table outside a department store. His voice had been small and defeated as he explained coverage options to disinterested shoppers. Katie didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of something closing, a door that had finally shut behind a chapter that shouldn't have been written in the first place. She stood in the captain's room that evening as he squeezed a therapy ball with increasing strength. His hand moved with purpose now, no longer the dead weight it had been. His parents embraced her with tears that carried a mother's gratitude and a father's relief. The worn combat boots sat on his bedside table. He'd asked for them during physical therapy, drawing strength from their scuffed leather like they were transmitting signals from soldiers who'd made it home. He reached over and touched them, his fingers tracing the dust of Ramadi that would never completely wash out. Through the window, she could see Miguel talking with the captain's family. Her son. No longer apologizing for what his mother had been. All of them finally understanding the woman who'd fought for their son when 12 doctors had walked away. The hospital had offered Katie a position as trauma coordinator, designing protocols that valued combat medical experience. Protocols built on the understanding that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. The break room filled when she entered now. Not emptied. Filled. Nurses asking questions about field medicine, about crisis decision-making, about how to hold someone's life together when everything is falling apart. She kept the photograph from the cardboard box in her new office, 8 faces, only 3 survivors, no longer hidden behind military redaction. No longer a secret that ate at her from the inside. The captain took his first supported steps, gripping parallel bars with determination that reminded Katie of young operators in Ramadi. His mother hugged her one more time, squeezing her like she could transfer gratitude through her hands. "You saved him twice," his mother said. "Once with your hands, once with your courage." Katie touched the captain's combat boots, thinking of the soldiers who never made it home. Thinking of Miguel who could now speak his mother's true name with pride instead of confusion. Thinking of 18 years spent hiding an identity that had defined her. Her senior chief petty officer shadow box now hung on her office wall next to her nursing credentials. Finally visible. Finally real. If you've ever had to hide who you really are, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd survived, subscribe for more stories about the heroes walking among us, the ones in scrubs saving lives in the dark. Drop a comment and tell us, what would you do if the Pentagon called your workplace? What would you risk to save someone no one else believed in? Like this video if you think quiet strength is the most dangerous kind.